Recently, a bunch of data has been shared about things happening in the game industry. It's, I think, a relatively good amount of research. Reflects a lot of non-obvious factors, different sides of it than you might hear oversimplified. Often, right, these are the kind of things that when people are asked what's going on, they want to give a simple two-sentence answer that's not quite ever what's going on. But the reason I'm making this video today is that longtime friend of mine, maybe more so acquaintance, we've seen each other at events, we know each other, IRL from multiple places. He was expressing what I think is a misunderstanding of the data. He's a very smart guy. He's a great level designer, great programmer, gives great talks all around. Nothing but a shining example of what I wish more people could find their way into doing in indie spheres. So none of this is anti or critical of any of that. What it is to say is that whereas he has spent 20 years making excellent games commercially, I have spent the past 20 years mostly making game developers, right? And that includes people getting into dozens of game studios. That includes organizing for leading IGDA Los Angeles, organizing 8, maybe 7 events through Indiecade, including the first Indiecade Paris, organizing over 85 talks for that, podcast interviewing, in and out of teaching at university, you name it. If there's a way that helps people get into games, I have been involved in that. Built online tools people use for their first projects and video courses people use. Anyway, my entire focus, right, for my whole career has been helping people with that bridge. So I have to keep eyes on that stuff. And the reasons why, so just let's boil it down to his observation. And again, I'm not going to name him because I don't like we're publicly beefing. That's not what this is. His observation, so I think a reasonable one, was okay, well, this data, when we look at all these numbers and like some big companies are having trouble, like, well, if you're indie side, why do you care, right? Like, isn't that even, who gives a darn, right? Isn't that just as well? Like, yeah, let it burn to the ground. People playing FIFA and Madden and for that matter, mobile stuff and gambling games, whatever else all fits under some sort of gaming umbrella. It's not the artistic stuff. It's not the really tasteful things going on. So why do we care? My concern, as someone who primarily, right, indie focused, indie interested, again, major organizer side, part of a much bigger team, right? I didn't run this. I wasn't the director, but part of the organizer team for Indiecade, helped over the years hundreds and hundreds of people build their indie team projects. I think over 500 projects for my communities. The thing of it is, the ecosystem, right, has challenges. The ecosystem is what I want to focus on in today's video. And it's one of these things where people look at nature and be like, I don't know, there's too many deer, so we'll add wolves or something, and it throws things out of whack. The ecosystem problem is several-fold. The first of all is that in many cases, right, one of the most strings-free, meaning without giving up control, ways to be able to make a game, to take chances on economically, and it's one I've often encouraged over the years. It's one Jake Burkett was recommended in one of his top viewed GDC talks. It is basically, can I balance outside contract gigs using my same set of skills for some company bigger than me that already has customer base and branding and whatever established? So it might feel like it's kind of like sellout work, but the reality is by doing that, I'm not having to compromise my vision to what potentially a publisher layer or a private investor or something would say, okay, well, because I'm funding it, I'm going to steer your work a different way. People can and some still do, find a way to keep building that runway in front of themselves to get the project done right, to do it the way that they think they ought to do it, take the direction, to take the chances creatively that they think it ought to have by doing work for the layer above them. And by saying layer above them, I mean like solo indies will work for small studios as contract gigs. Small studios will actually do contract work for mid-size studios and up the chain, including, this is where some of the time you'll see for like AAA games, they might outsource to some mid-sized studio that might not be on the front of the box. They actually built the multiplayer side. They actually handled one of the ports. They find ways, okay, you have the skills, you have the network, you have the muscle memory as a team, you have the horsepower, the skill set to handle getting this done correctly so you can do the VR version or something. And so when there's problems at the very top, the whole ecosystem, again, has challenges that breaks that potential means of finding funding in sort of a sustainable way, as opposed to simply, I have enough money to burn, which is not usually a great idea anyway, or giving up control in favor of, okay, well, I found outside funding, but now they are ultimately steering the direction that we're doing. That is where they start to steer us towards higher chance of it's going to work, right? And this is even at the top level. And it's like even take a moment to acknowledge some of the weird dynamics at the largest level. My time 20 years ago in AAA, which again, a lifetime ago, I was on a team doing some pretty creative, weird stuff, right? Boom Blocks was a pretty neat, unusual thing. And it's part of why I wound up in the Smithsonian, which I'm very proud of, despite being a small part of what happened on that project. But it's something that the reason EA could take that chance on this unproven thing and this newer system and this kind of weird thing is because they were cranking out this bread and butter franchises, FIFA at the time, Tiger Woods, golf, Need for Speed franchise, all the stuff that sells like hotcakes reliably. is what enables them to actually be able to put real funding horsepower behind taking some wild bets and swinging for the fences. Counterintuitively, those projects that again feel like the sellouty stuff that there's some demand for, people want that, it's enabling even the bigger companies, when you see them do take any risks, right? If all they have is enough sales to cover their costs, they can't actually be as risky. And this is where we see them start to reel in. Anyway, back to the ecosystem focus. The other thing that's going on, right, is when we talk about risk taking, events in schools related to game development are partly connected to the bigger game industry in terms of the bigger studios, where many more of the jobs that are, we all know it's been a rocky time, but frankly, more stable as salaried positions or more continuous year to year than the smaller studio environments of kind of, will this still be here in 5 months kind of existential uncertainty. Well, what's going on there is that, again, those schools and the events start to dry up if the bigger company jobs aren't there. Because when people are choosing what to major in, what to do with their lives, where to spend their focus and their social networks and so on, part of the calculation is, what's my fallback? And this is one of the things why, like, in my generation, we did a comp sci degree, in part because, okay, well, if games what if games has weird years ahead, we could pivot into general software engineering or something. When people go into these programs, even if they want to do more auteur kind of work, more indie kind of work, more taking some big chances, maybe earlier in life when they've got sort of plenty of time to recover, part of what they're going into that with is the mindset that my fallback plan, I could go get a job at Ubisoft or EA or Activision or some mid-sized studio, assuming there are more mid-sized studios than there are anymore. And so that's where, even where, okay, well, who cares if that stuff burns down? There's often not a visible match to where the actual funding is coming from these projects. Because that's not, it's not super compelling. It's not what people are interested in hearing about. It's not theirs, right, in any meaningful sense of the word. Someone else told them what to do. There was money on the table to port this to iPhone at a different version or whatever. In some cases, too, like contractually, and I say we because I did this too, right? My career started, my first contract gig that got me out of even the startup scene after the AAA scene was making a solar panel game for an advertisement for like a company making solar panels, get a coupon code. Part of the contract was I wasn't getting credit for that. I got paid more by essentially ghostwriting it because I wasn't taking credit, which is furthermore, like, we're not hiding it. We legally, in some cases, aren't supposed to focus too much on like, oh, that's my game. It's not. It's that organization's. I did it as sort of a merc work to fund me taking my weird early indie chances. So again, there's that non-obvious shakeup of like these big companies that feel kind of sellouty are part to keep the money churning. The other thing I pointed out, right, and for a lot of people, they get their game consoles, they get their Steam install, they get the setup on this stuff, often first and foremost for those big games. They've got the budgets, they've got the visibility, enough of their friends are aware of it. It was probably 2006 or so. We had I don't need to say the guy's name. He worked at a company that ported Madden to different consoles. And that was that was a large part of what they did to help subsidize on the side their own IP that they were developing as a small to mid-sized studio back then. And one of the students in the room, I remember asked him, like, do you feel like a sellout making like Madden stuff work on just more consoles? Like, isn't, I grew up playing these other Ninja Gaiden and Battletoads, and are we missing that? And his point was two things. One, it's not about replacing that. It is about a bigger group of people totally playing games, right? People who were never going to play those. Like, those games still exist and were still getting made. People who were going to play those still could get their ninja games and their fighting frog games. Meanwhile, a lot of folks who, like, I don't know, my brother, and it's not a diss, like, he's a smart, great guy, got the console for Madden, right? Or got the console in their house all over the world for FIFA or for Need for Speed or you name it. And again, it's because the Call of Duties, right? This is where it's got the recognition. Enough of my friends at school are familiar with it. I've seen it. I know what it is. I feel safe trying it out or whatever. It doesn't seem weird. Doesn't get me tagged as a nerd as some of the more esoteric stuff might, which some of us don't care about. It's part of our identity. For a lot of folks, they want to kind of feel more like, oh, this is a normal thing to do. I'm not turning into a whole identity around it. That is often the bridge too. And as this guy said, who did, again, Madden ports, once that console is in their home, once they already have a PlayStation or have an Xbox or have even just Steam installed and they're up and using it, which 2006, I don't know, maybe it wasn't quite the conversation we're having, but you get the point now. I'm kind of contextualizing it. Well, now they're a step away from, well, now I could just try one of these other games, right? Now I already am familiar with kind of the general structure. And, oh, there's this thing I get popped up, a little ad, or my friend mentioned or heard about it on a podcast or someone posted about it, and they're now a step away from it. But a lot of people, there's too high of a hurdle in many cases too, that I could go buy a $500 machine for indie games in most cases, right? That's not typically where a lot of people start. So it's one of the other factors there. The other thing about this ecosystem, these non-obvious ties, and this is where especially I use Indicate as an example because the one I've known the best, or if I'm under IGDA, etc. Because, again, the guy's counterpoint, okay, well, lots of great music doesn't come from conservatories, lots of great art doesn't come from art schools or something. But what's not obvious going on there is that there are these connections of networks of people who've dedicated, again, our lives. I've taught in university a couple of years and still plenty of friends in those circles, and it's then part of a periphery version of ecosystem, the main work that I do still. It's something where a lot of those people have been able to commit their time and energy trying to foster those early talent networks, those connections, those opportunities, those ways of thinking, those making sure that they're aware of these contests and competitions. Again, it's part of Indicators, part of that, IGF sort of thing's part of that. And what those serve is a non-obvious thing where, first of all, again, there's sort of an invisible layer of those people steering those people towards each other. Out of all the things they could be doing with their early lives, they're focusing on this, again, with a fallback plan. I could work for a studio if I needed to. They're helping direct work to, like, there's really something here. You should consider submitting this to one of these festivals or events. And what a lot of people outside these circles, and this guy, he's giving talks for this event, he understands what this event is. It's not like once you've given a talk for these events, once you got selected or an award, like I was a finalist in 2010, it did not change my life. But what it enables you to do is you've got one more sort of reassurance. And so, like, one of the things that I've done with that organization have been their alum. I helped start their Indicate alumni program. I helped organize that for several years, spanning like 1,400 projects of contacting alumni from different years and where they've gone on to today. And one of the things that goes on is often there's this story, right? I would interview them at E3 a couple years in a row, and they would talk about how they were sort of unsure if they were doing the right thing, if they're in the right space, if they're taking the right approach. And then they got some recognition from Indicate, which was the kind of event and festival, and still is to this day, although now it's fully online. Part of what I love about it, it's, IGF is often looking like, what is going to sell on Steam? Like, that's kind of the question that IGF is often grappling with, which that's a valid question to ask, and it's a commercial-related event. Indicate is much more of an arts festival, and so it'll look at stuff that's a little more raw, unusual, experimental. Sometimes my favorite stuff that we had at that festival was people would look at this, and they would, not quite be mad, but they would be confused. They're like, this isn't even a game. What is this doing here? And then within a year or two, that was a whole genre of indie games because it was ahead of the curve, because it was doing something a little more rough, a little more interesting, a little more out there, and then it found its footing, or through enough years of polish. So my favorite example, you can't see it off camera, got a big old Outer Wilds framed painting over part of my room. Like, Outer Wilds, I started as a student project who was one of the advisors on that, was one of the Indicate organizers with me, Jeremy Gibson Bond. One of the other faculty advisors at USC, Peter Brinson, who also is himself a multi-time Indicate awardee person. They helped steer that team towards getting the game involved in submitting to, and didn't get them favoritism towards selection because that's a separate part of that committee, but like some early prod that even as this weird, rough prototype, people thought Outer Wilds was a neat thing to talk about, was a cool thing to discuss. But it was rough, and you could check out the prototype. In fact, in addition to the research I'm talking about, again, the Matthew Ball stuff, which it's worth reading through if nothing else, I also linked to the Outer Wilds prototype video in the description. It is weird to see because of how much of what the game eventually became is already there, right? It already has the flying off the planets. It already has the anglerfish. It's already got, like, the planets are a lot of the same stuff. And it's fascinating to see because of how raw it is. It looks worse than most game jams. And I say loving it. Again, a huge Outer Wilds fan. But without those people in that ecosystem able to recognize this thing early on, because it was not winning awards and getting major funding until years later, right? It took a space that could look at something that's a little rough, where the curatorial voices who have dedicated our lives in different ways towards trying to help spot there's something here. You should take this more seriously. Double down on this. Get funding for this. Get this in front of more eyeballs. This is incredible and more people know about it, but it will not break into the mainstream until it finds a way, right, to sort of pass certain levels of polish, and that is where these layers are non-obvious. Their connectivity between, with no USC, and also like one of the other co-founders, right, Stephanie Barish went there. I can't recall if, I should know this, she was my grad advisor. I can't recall if Celia Pierce worked there, but everything else was certainly connected to that scene as well. Sam Roberts, etc. No USC, no Indicate. No Indicate, no Outer Wilds. And it doesn't mean these people wouldn't have gone on to do cool stuff, but it is to say without these sort of non-obvious things, and it's also like a lot of my indie work, right? So Celia Pierce, when I went to Arts Games History in Atlanta, presented some of my weird experimental gameplay stuff, Celia like slipped me a piece of paper and was like, submit your stuff to Indicate. That got me into these circles, which then helped me early in my career go indie direction. The person's critique that, well, there were neat games in the 90s, there were so many fewer people in that scene, right? And this is where, like, even like the first IGFs, certainly the ones that I saw, were like there were like 8 people there. There were 8 little like booths up in a corner. It was not the presence that it has taken on of significance as a space that has such a rich number of voices doing wildly different stuff. And again, it is the ecosystem is my stress and my concern. It is not just the isolated. There will always be someone who, despite all barriers, there will always be somebody out there who will do great things regardless. In the gradient of the voices we get to hear from, a lot of people cannot take those kinds of risks unless they're able to sustainably fund their efforts by finding contract work that uses the skills that they have extra training and that set them apart in the marketplace, or unless they can find collaborators who are at a higher level of seriousness and a higher level of really kind of going in on this together, who then like go on. And so like people I worked with in Georgia Tech founded a VR studio together at a time when that was an experimental kind of bet, had a head start in that space. And these are the sort of things that, again, without that ecosystem, without the plan of, okay, well, worst case scenario, there's kind of this gradient, and I suspect a lot of you are in kind of the same headspace as me. I would rather not work at blank, but I would sooner work at blank and kind of as a ramp. And this is not to diminish anybody who works these places. I got friends who work these places. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. But it's like, okay, well, I'd rather not work on web casual. I'd rather not work on casual mobile. And it's just a closeness to like what types of games we personally play, we personally grew up with. That's valid. But it's that security fallback net that enables people to take the chances of, let me try this. And if it fails me, I was able to take that chance safely because I have a way to catch myself, or I perceive that I do. That is why it still matters when these other things get shaken up. Another part, and I don't want to focus too much on this point, it's not, I think, the main point, but there's also a separation of when we are adults, and this person's also kind of plus or minus my generation, our relationship to media is so wildly different, right? It's like our relationship to when you're a child. I think it was Twinbeard I first heard this point from, talking about Frog Fractions, about how like the world is magical to children, right? It just is such a different perception. When a child sees a character in a mascot costume, to a child, that is Mickey Mouse, right? Like that bull alongside the court, that's a bull. That's pretty cool. And the older we get, the more we start to realize like, yeah, that's a sweaty guy who's probably not getting paid very well and may not be having a great day and might rather not be in there, right? Our relationship to this stuff is different as we age, and especially from the developer side, where we see all the nuts and bolts. We can see, and it's like when writers talk about reading books, they can tell when the person was kind of getting tired, when they had to leave and take a break and come back. They can see all of that. And adult developer eyes, when we look at these games, I think a lot of what we miss is what those kids are seeing is actually, in many ways, certainly as valid as what we saw when we were in their age. And our stuff, if we really get hard about it and go back and look at the details, our stuff we were loving was pretty rough by comparison, right? I loved it. It was still impressive at the time. It's not to take away from those achievements. I think we get some rose-tinted glasses of it. So it's like the voices on the news who all kind of say like, oh, the world used to be better, in a way that all lines up to when they're ages 5 to 15, because they were oblivious to adult perspective. They were oblivious to adult responsibilities. They were oblivious to a lot of harsh, negative things that were going on in the world, in many cases worse, but it wasn't their problem yet. So they're kind of not thinking about it anyway. But different people, right, what they're growing up with, for some of these kids, and this is going to sound like a uncomfortable thing for some of us face, like it's their Roblox games. They're playing a Roblox game that to them, that's their connection to the social space and their friends. And I know it can sound like that's not the games we played. That's true. And ours aren't the ones that the people before us played, and vice versa. It's a whole thing. Anyway, again, that's a whole other thread I want to focus on. So ecosystem shakeup, fallback plans, educational pipelines, events, infrastructure stuff, all concerning. And it's just one of those deals where it's useful to be mindful of the other fact and the reality. Again, this is seen a lot of over my podcasting years. This is our 10th year now. A lot of people's stories are very zigzaggy. They start doing one thing at a big company. That's how they make some connections. Those connections then run off, right? And so, I mean, what was it? Amir Rao, former coworker of mine, briefly at EA, Supergiant Games. A lot of those people met each other at the big studio, right? Or another guy, he went off to an internship at Zynga back during like heyday of Farmville, and his classmates were like, I thought you liked games as art, and I thought you appreciated the medium, and this seems like a big sellout move. His next job was on Psychonauts 2, with, I think he would help make that connection was a mixture of some maybe connections he had made through that Zynga team, who then maybe wound up over at Double Fine, and or the internship helped him get the leg up in terms of opportunity ahead of a bunch of people who thought they were too good to have spent a little time at that kind of studio or environment, right? And it helped me early in my career that I was ex-EA. Still to this day, it comes up. Still, they have people on the podcast who I knew through that time at that studio who trust me, even if they wound up elsewhere, because that ecosystem existed and thrived. And even if it wasn't the right fit for me or the long-term right fit for him, they become a helpful step in our journey. And for a lot of game developers, this is what I was getting at with the podcast. A lot of people's journey is very bouncing around. If I spent some time at big company and small company, and I went off and we did some crazy experiment for some sort of arcade hardware that ultimately didn't ship, or we tried some stuff that had never been seen before, that fell on its face. So to recover, we went off and got the safer job of the bigger thing. It's all part of the ecosystem. And so it's why it's part of being mindful of, even if it's not for you, even if what you're doing is working for you, that is great. But it is a recognition of the risks, the circumstances, the difference, the fact the world today is not shaped the way it was in 1997, is not shaped the way it was in 2007 or even 2017. Things keep changing. The landscape keeps changing. In many ways, it has been, despite the dovetailing in different directions, in many ways for the better creatively in terms of the technical landscape. The amount of people who have access to the tools, access to be able to reach an audience, ways to do things. But there is a very real shakeup that we are still all trying to learn how to navigate together. Still trying to figure out implications, when, how, if it recovers in which ways. And those aftershocks, again, find their way beyond the most obvious places. It becomes a challenge for everyone in that ecosystem if we go to GDC. And so like last year, there were no recruiters, right? And again, I think I mentioned this, my first GDC was like 2005, I think. And this was the first year that I know of that there were literally no recruiters. Not in the hangouts, not in the parties, not in the after events, not out at lunches, not on the floor, not at booths. Didn't see them. Notable absence. Now, again, maybe I missed one or two. I'm not saying that there was factually zero. I'm saying that this was, talked to my friends about this. They agreed, like, yeah, where the hell are they? Because it was just not the year for that last year. That affects, again, the people who are going to feel comfortable taking a path where that was going to be their fallback plan. And this is where I think we've heard, I think it might have been, I can't remember whose figure this was, 1 in 3 people who used to be going their way into games are now pivoted out, right? The upside to that, very silver linings about bad times, the upside to that is that when and if things start to let up, or where you do find there is an opening, because, you know, the economy might be in a rough spot for the field, but that company's economy, that individual's economy might be doing better. If there's fewer people trying to push their way through that door, because it's not a booming time, and a third of your competition bailed without even trying, well, maybe you would have actually lost to them before, but now they got to pick between the people who are applying. Maybe none of whom check all the boxes for that position, especially out of people willing to do it for that amount of money. But there you are, and you might be able to find your way in it. Some people who are sticking around, who are able to fight their way through it and stay afloat. There's some upsides. There silver lining in those dark clouds. Anyway, that's it. I could keep rambling for a while. Again, this is what I've dedicated 2 decades of my life to doing, helping people with that bridge, focusing on within the nonprofit level, within the school level, within the individual and the freelance spheres, etc., how people get their footing into their first game careers, game jobs, folks who are trying to go indie with me to improve their odds, folks who are also just doing it as a hobbyist or a freeware type, and this is where, I'm a huge proponent of this, big advocate of it, but also the switch is very different for if that's the approach you're taking, you got to not fool yourself and pretend like you're playing business and then chuck, too much money into a hole. That's just not the shape of what you're after, realistically, in terms of priorities. Anyway, that's it for now. If you want to work with me, I got to put this plug right. Home Team Game Dev is the main way I work with people. Got all kinds of other courses and stuff, but that's the main way I help people with navigating their own challenges in this stuff, advising around what are their goals, what are their circumstances, what are they trying to do. You'll see that we've got different pathways that kind of all fit together. I'm going to give you a whole pitch today. That's just Home Team Game Dev is the thing I mostly do. That's part of for the past 10 years also, helping people get started with this stuff. Again, not quite. I think in October that'll be 10 years, but this is 2015 start, 2025 now. Anyway, that's it for now. Take it easy. Keep making games. I will see you all next time. Bye for now.